All right, and we will call the meeting to order. Thank you all for being here. This morning we have testimony from the Northern Command and the Southern Command, and it is a very topical time to have both of them in. There's a lot going on in both areas. We will have 4 witnesses with opening testimony. We have General Terrance J, who is the commander of the U.S. Northern Command, Admiral Craig Fowler, who is the commander of U.S. Southern Command, the Honorable Kathryn Wheelbarger, who is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and the Honorable Kenneth Rapuano, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Global Security. And as I was mentioning when I met with these 2 gentlemen earlier, we do not have to say this will probably be your last time before you testify before us. We've had a lot of turnover and a lot of folks coming before us for the last time, but both of you, I think, as far as we know, going to be here for a little while. Before we begin, I do want to start on a sad note. Many of you, some of us up here, served with Ellen Tauscher, who is a member of the Armed Services Committee for a little over 12 years. She passed away this week, very sadly. I came into Congress actually in 1996 with Ellen, served in this committee with her for her whole time before she moved over to the Obama administration to engage in arms-controlled discussions with the Russians. Ellen was a terrific person and a great member of this committee. She will be missed by many, and I just want to express my condolences and sympathies for her family and friends, and just mention what a great pleasure it was serving with her, and appreciate her service to our country and to her district. Mac, did you want to say anything?
Thank you, sir. I would just add that I think Ellen reflects the best of the bipartisan traditions of this committee. She worked on both sides of the aisle, especially on nuclear arms control issues, a wonderful, warm, caring person, and I think we're all going to miss her, but also continue to benefit from the example she set for both of us, and I appreciate the opportunity to say that.
Thank you. And with that, as I mentioned, we are having the testimony from the Southern Command and the Northern Command, and it is a very, very interesting time. I think that the most topical thing right at the moment to hear from the Southern Command is on the issue of Venezuela and what is happening down there really minute by minute. There's a lot going on in that area. And I do want to emphasize how important it is to get a stable government in Venezuela, and my belief that the Maduro government is not legitimate. The facts, I think, make that clear. And the devastation throughout Venezuela shows how their leadership has impacted that country. The statistics are staggering of the incredible rise in poverty and malnutrition, the people who are displaced. It is devastating for Venezuela, but it's also devastating for the region. Some of us were on this committee when we passed Plan Colombia, and we've worked with Colombia for literally decades now to try to combat the narco-terrorists down there, and really made an enormous amount of progress. That progress is threatened by the instability in Venezuela as refugees pour across the border and as various criminals, terrorists, and violent organizations take advantage of that instability. Trying to get back to a more stable situation in Venezuela is enormously important. We'll also be very interested by the role that both Cuba and Russia are playing in that region, as Russia in particular attempts to expand their reach. We have seen obviously what they've done meddling in Europe and in the Middle East, but I think this is instructive of just how ambitious President Putin's plans are to spread Russia's malign influence throughout the globe. We'll be interested in hearing about that. And the broader overarching issue with Southern Command is almost always the drug trafficking, how we can contain the drugs that flow south to north. And the one piece, and I spoke yesterday with Admiral Fowler about this, is we have to focus on I believe, total approach to this and look at the demand side of this. If there was not the demand in the United States of America for these drugs, they wouldn't come. And as long as the demand remains as high as it is, it's going to be incredibly expensive and difficult to stop them. So I think it would be instructive not to just try to stop the drug cartels from shipping them north, but what can we do to combat the entire problem, a whole of government approach, working with people here domestically in the United States to try to reduce the demand for drugs. And Northern Command, obviously we're very focused on the southern border, and I've given speeches about that before. I won't take this moment to do that. But we do have a significant challenge on the southern border right now. The sheer number of people who are flowing towards the border is overwhelming our ability to process the asylum seekers that are coming. And we need to come up with a plan for that, because right now, the only thing that I would hope we could all agree on is what we're doing now is not working. So I would appreciate some insights about how we can change that to try to address the situation. Would only offer one specific thought. Again, like with the drugs, focusing on stopping them from coming in as opposed to stopping the demand is perhaps the wrong approach. When it comes to the border, focusing on how can we stop these people once they get here, we have to figure out some way to change the equation so that they don't want to come. The best way to do that is to have greater prosperity and stability in the countries that they are coming from. They are fleeing violence, poverty, and hopelessness. Until we replace those things, it's hard to imagine that they're going to stop making that choice. So we're going to, again, need a comprehensive approach to addressing that problem and challenge. And I look forward to the testimony from all four of our witnesses. And with that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in welcoming our witnesses. Appreciate each of you being here. All of us are intensely focused on the developments in Venezuela. Week before last, I had the opportunity to be there on the border and to listen to some of the thousands of people who are streaming across that border every day and hear their desire to be freed from oppression and to have a chance for a better life. As you said, I think we all have something at stake here. I'm also very disturbed by the reports of Russian, Cuban, Chinese, other interference there. For example, I think the Secretary of State has said that Maduro was ready to leave yesterday, but the Russians wouldn't let him. So there is tremendous concern not only about the people of Venezuela, but about foreign manipulation that prevents the people of Venezuela from having a better life. And of course, a lot of that is directed against us. I would also just say that my takeaway from visiting at least 3 of the countries in South America was we have tremendous opportunities there. Tremendous economic, security, all sorts of opportunities, but we also have significant concerns. Chinese involvement and the Russian, Iranian, other things that you have mentioned. A lot of issues to talk today, and obviously protecting the homeland is absolutely central to the purpose of the Department of Defense and the federal government, and there are a variety of ways that, a variety of concerns that we have. Last thing I would say is, and it goes beyond the scope of this committee and this hearing, but I completely agree with your statement that we need a more comprehensive approach to deal with the challenges at the southern border. Part of that is helping the countries of Central America so that people are not have a safer place to stay. Part of it, in my opinion, is the asylum laws in the United States. Part of it is doing better for the Department of Homeland Security so they can do their job rather than rely on the military. A lot of that is beyond our scope. I know we will talk about some of those aspects. The key thing is, maybe more so than any time I've been on this committee, our own hemisphere is at stake with American national security in ways that I think it hasn't been before. And so I think it's appropriate to have these witnesses, and I look forward to hearing their testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Rapuano, we'll start with you.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to be here with General O'Shaughnessy, Admiral Fowler, and Assistant Secretary Wheelbarger. For the Department of Defense, defending the homeland is our highest priority. Our homeland, once a sanctuary, is threatened by potential adversaries that are developing a wide range of capabilities to threaten the homeland. Our adversaries are developing these capabilities to threaten or to commit acts of aggression against the United States. Their actions are intended to limit U.S. response options, thus preventing us from defending our allies and partners. China and Russia, by far our most advanced potential adversaries, increasingly developing 21st century technologies to hold the U.S. homeland at risk, employing systems intended to deny our advantages, delay our warning time, and likely target our civil infrastructure, These capabilities include anti-satellite systems, hypersonic glide vehicles, and advanced cyber capabilities. While North Korea has not conducted any nuclear-capable missile tests in more than a year, it retains weapons of mass destruction. North Korea also possesses cyber capabilities and has demonstrated its intent to use them to threaten the U.S. homeland. Iran continues to work on a space launch vehicle, reducing the timeline to development of intercontinental range ballistic missiles. Although our focus is on great power competition and rogue states, we must continue to address the threat posed by violent extremist organizations. ISIS and others continue to strive for opportunities to strike the U.S. homeland. The defense of the homeland is not restricted to adversaries abroad. In providing defense support to civil authorities, my office coordinates the Department's role for disaster relief and border security support to the Department of Homeland Security. To meet this range of challenges, the administration released its National Security Strategy. This informed the National Defense Strategy, which in turn helped shape the National Military Strategy. A common thread throughout all these documents is the need to strengthen homeland defense by enhancing our deterrence and assurance posture, improving our ability to respond if deterrence fails, and strengthening our negotiating position against adversaries. To that end, every element of my team is focused on strengthening U.S. homeland defense. I'd like to highlight outer space. Space is a key domain for our national and homeland defense. However, the space domain is changing, and we must address growing foreign counter-space threats. Thus, the Department provided Congress a legislative proposal for the establishment of the U.S. Space Force as a new branch of our armed forces. The Space Force will catalyze the Department's transformation of space as a warfighting domain to ensure we are postured to deter aggression and, if necessary, are prepared to defend our vital interests in space. Cyber Policy's development of the Defense Cyber Strategy and first-ever Cyber Posture Review has put the Department of Defense on a path to fight and win against a capable adversary, enhance the effectiveness of the joint force, defend critical infrastructure, secure DoD information anywhere, and prioritize cyber cooperation with partners and allies. These objectives, along with our intent to defend forward, puts the United States in a far better position to protect the homeland and counter adversary aggression. Additionally, the Department is enhancing its missile defenses for the homeland and improving its ability to counter unmanned aircraft systems to further deny potential adversaries any potential advantage of using these capabilities against the homeland. Support to the homeland is not limited to countering foreign adversaries. We must also be prepared to support civil authorities. DoD actively supports the DHS mission on the border because border security is a core element of national security. The immigration crisis on the southwest border poses significant national security and humanitarian challenges for the nation and threatens to overwhelm the Department of Homeland Security. In the last 6 months, over 430,000 undocumented aliens have been apprehended on the southwest border, which already surpasses the total number of aliens apprehended in the entire fiscal year of 2018. Last month alone, over 92,000 undocumented aliens were apprehended on the border. DHS will continue to need DoD support into the foreseeable future until they have the necessary resources and tools to properly exercise their responsibilities. Each of these missions have greatly contributed to homeland defense and are pivotal to enhancing the U.S. deterrence and assurance posture, improving our ability to respond should deterrence fail, and strengthening our ability to deter or defeat potential adversaries that threaten our way of life. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Wheelbarger.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. We enjoy enormous potential in our hemisphere, given the significant cooperation we receive from our partners and the democratic values we share with most nations in the region. Our vision is for a hemisphere that is collaborative, prosperous, and secure. But we face significant challenges as well, and Venezuela is the foremost example. Yet we have unprecedented regional unity at this historical moment, and the United States and our international partners continue to harness diplomatic, information, and economic means to encourage a peaceful transition of power. For the Department of Defense, we have responded to Interim President Guaido's call for humanitarian aid by assisting USAID in those efforts to pre-position aid in Colombia. We face other challenges in the region as well, including autocratic regimes in Cuba and Nicaragua, terrorist and criminal organizations, trafficking, natural disasters, and external actors seeking undue influence over countries' decisions. For the department, our partnerships are paramount. We deepen our relationships to address shared challenges and focus on interoperability, intelligence sharing, science and technology cooperation, advancing cyber defenses, and expanding exercises. We counter illicit trafficking by supporting law enforcement agencies and emphasizing human rights training. We prioritize regional cooperation in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and we emphasize defense institution building because strong institutions and anti-corruption measures encourage efficiency and support legitimate government. And as we see in Venezuela, the Western Hemisphere is a region of great power competition. We counter Chinese and Russian influence by gaining the trust of our partners to achieve objectives together. Unlike relationships with Russia and China, our cooperation is built on respect, collaboration, and a desire to bolster prosperity and security for all. With that, I'll simply conclude by saying the department takes a global view of the challenges we face and remains committed to the region. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And let me just say, you told me beforehand that your statement would be 2 minutes, and it was exactly 2 minutes. That is incredibly impressive in this line of work, so I appreciate that. General O'Shaughnessy.
Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry and distinguished members of the committee, I'm truly honored to be here today as a commander of the United States Northern Command and the U.S.-Canadian Binational Command, North American Aerospace Defense Command. I'm also proud to testify this morning alongside my good friend, Craig Fowler. And Craig and the U.S. Southcom team are vital partners and continue to bring our commands closer together to better defend our nation. And I'm also proud to appear with our great OSD partners, Assistant Secretaries Rapuano and Wheelbarger. U.S. Northcom and NORAD are two complementary but distinct commands driven by a single, unyielding priority, defending the homeland from attack. In this era of rapidly evolving technology and renewed great power competition, the need for energized and active defense of the homeland cannot be overstated. Revisionist powers of Russia and China have given every indication that their security strategies are based on holding the United States at risk with both conventional and nuclear weapons, and they have signaled that we must anticipate attacks against our civilian and defense infrastructure in the event of a conflict. Russia has modernized its aviation and submarine fleets and fielded long-range cruise missiles designed to evade radar detection. Russia and China continue their efforts to penetrate our networks while developing and testing hypersonic glide vehicles, and both have also established a noticeably stronger foothold in the Arctic along the northern approaches to the United States and Canada. As a result, the strategic value of the Arctic as our first line of defense has reemerged, and U.S. Northcom and NORAD are taking active measures to ensure our ability to detect, track, and defeat potential threats in that region. Our adversaries have engaged in deliberate, focused efforts over a number of years to exploit our perceived weaknesses. As a result, it is clear that our homeland is not a sanctuary. Our mission to deter our adversaries is dependent on our ability to detect and defeat potential threats to our homeland. And I'm grateful to the committee for your strong support of U.S. Northcom and NORAD along the lines of the efforts, for example, fielding AESA radars for our aerospace control alert fighters and improving the capability and capacity of our missile defense sensors and interceptors clearly demonstrates our shared sense of urgency. In that same spirit, we must take prudent steps now to ensure our next-generation defensive capabilities, to include a space-based sensing layer for missile defense, are not too late to need. We must develop an integrated family of systems, including undersea, terrestrial, airborne, and space-based sensors with a sense of urgency. Given the fact that our adversaries are already developing these and testing these weapons, time is of the utmost importance. And while the challenges facing us are significant, I have great faith that through collaboration with industry and harnessing the power of innovation in the United States of America, we will restore our competitive advantage and continue to outpace any adversary that might threaten our homeland. And I sincerely appreciate the committee's work to provide much-needed predictability and stability with an on-time budget in FY19. And I'm also grateful for the committee's ongoing efforts to ensure that we avoid the devastating, deep-cutting impacts that a return to sequestration would bring to the Department of Defense. U.S. Northcom and NORAD work every day with our partners to keep our citizens safe while confronting challenges emanating from multiple approaches and in all domains. I especially want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the amazing men and women in the National Guard who are great partners and critical to our ability to perform our missions. And whether intercepting Russian bombers off the coast of Alaska or providing much-needed support along our federal law enforcement partners along our southern border, the airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians of U.S. Northcom and NORAD are deeply committed to defending our nations. And I'm honored to represent them today, and we have the watch. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Admiral Fowler.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today with my shipmates, General O'Shaughnessy, Assistant Secretary of Defense Rapuano, and Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense Wheelbarger. Also, thanks this committee for the steadfast support you provide our men and women every day. The Western Hemisphere is our shared home, our neighborhood. We're connected to the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean by shared democratic traditions, culture, and geography. From my headquarters in Doral, Florida, it takes me longer to travel to D.C. than it does to many countries in my area of responsibility. We're connected to our neighbors in every domain: sea, air, land, space, and cyber, and most importantly, shared values. Only by working together can we meet current and future global challenges. Ultimately, what we want is enemies to fear us, friends to partner with us, and the Western Hemisphere to shine as a beacon of peace, democracy, and prosperity. To ensure the security of our homeland, Southcom works closely with our interagency teammates from the Department of State, USAID, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice, to name just a few. This teamwork, especially with Northern Command and the U.S. Coast Guard, is critical to mission accomplishment. Over the past 5 months, I've traveled throughout Central America, South America, and the Caribbean to get a firsthand view of the opportunities and the challenges that directly impact the security of our hemisphere and our homeland. Criminal organizations, narco-trafficking, illegal migration, violent extremists, corruption, all enabled by weak governance, are principal among these challenges. The most disturbing insight, however, that I've garnered in my time in command has been the degree to which external state actors have been rapidly expanding their presence and influence in the Western Hemisphere. Across the world, to include in our neighborhood, democratic values are under assault by China, Russia, and Iran. So how do we best counter these threats to our neighborhood? Security cooperation is our best tool to continue building on the strong partnerships in the region and turn the challenges of the hemisphere into opportunities. Our partners are doing great things every day. In this hemisphere, in our neighborhood, a little goes a long way. We need the right, focused, and consistent military presence. We cannot achieve positive results and influence outcomes without being on the playing field. But every security challenge and threat in our hemisphere is compounded by the crisis in Venezuela. Russia provides lifelines through loans, technical and military support, and rhetoric. China is Venezuela's single largest state creditor, saddling the Venezuelan people with more than $50 billion in debt and exporting surveillance technology used to monitor and repress the Venezuelan people. Iran has restarted direct flights from Tehran and reinvigorated diplomatic ties. Ever-present Cuba provides critical personnel and resources to prop up a corrupt and illegitimate dictator. In the face of this malign influence, the rest of the world unites in support of Venezuela's legitimate leader, interim President Guaido. A transition to legitimate democracy is underway. And I have a message for the professionals in the Venezuelan military and security forces. The brutal dictatorship of Maduro has led to this man-made crisis. Cuba and Russia have invaded your country and disgraced your sovereignty. You have a chance to do the right thing and alleviate the suffering of your people and your families, those you have sworn an oath to protect. When a legitimate democracy has been restored, we look forward to having you return to the profession of arms, including attendance at the United States military training and education. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Thornberry, thank you again for the opportunity to testify. The Southcom team, our civilians and military members, and our families appreciate the support Congress has provided. We will continue to honor your trust and our fellow citizens have placed in us. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. Admiral, I'll start with you and picking up where you left off on Venezuela. What is sort of the military's role in what's going on down there? Because I agree with your statement that Maduro is not a legitimate president. We need to have a transition to a true democracy and a legitimate leader in Venezuela. I am concerned, though, that we would think that there is some sort of role for the U.S. military, given our history down there and given what we've learned about using the military to sort of change governments. What role do you see for our military and what's going on in Venezuela, and where do you see the limits of that role?
We've been focused on working with our regional partners, intelligence sharing, information sharing, gathering and generating a shared appreciation for the complexities associated with the problem, the impacts both in Venezuela, the horrific starvation, over 90% of the population starving, and the impacts of security with the partners, and looking at a way to apply our security assistance in a mutually beneficial way. That's been the primary line of effort. Secondary line of effort has been focused on planning for non-combatant evacuation and protection of American citizens and lives within Venezuela. Prudent planning, as you'd expect, Chairman, for a combatant commander. The look in support of USAID was mentioned by our colleagues here. USAID, we've supported the delivery of humanitarian aid, and we're working and planning with USAID. And then more broadly, we're looking at a day after, when we have a democratic Venezuela, how do we work with their militaries in security cooperation that's representative of a normal mill-to-mill relationship? Those have been our priorities, sir.
But you do not see a role for the U.S. military in actually overthrowing the Maduro government, correct?
Our leadership's been clear. Should be primarily a democratic transition. We're in total support of diplomacy, and we stand ready to support that effort, sir.
And one final question in this area on the sanctions. Obviously, Venezuela has many challenges. You've outlined some of them. What role do you see U.S. sanctions on Venezuela having played in the economic difficulties that are there? And how do you balance sort of the pressure we want to put on the regime to change with the potential impact of those sanctions?
The misery of the people of Venezuela came about as a result of the illegitimate dictator's actions and inept way with which he's run the country, and China and Cuba's complete inclusion in that problem set. The sanctions have been a necessary tool to help apply pressure to accelerate the diplomatic efforts. The misery began and ends with Maduro.
And it's worth noting that, much like Putin and Russia, a huge part of the problem is that Maduro and his cronies take all the money. They don't care about the people whatsoever. They're, running a kleptocracy there, and the people are the ones who are paying the price for that. A couple quick questions on the border side of it, and I'll shift over to the policy folks. It seems, if you go back before the Trump administration started implementing its immigration policies, we are in much worse shape now than we were when that started. Do you see any connection between a variety of those policies and what's happening on the border? And if so, have you started to talk about how you might do things differently? And I guess that's for Mr. Rapuano.
So we do not deeply assess the causation in terms of the desire of individuals to immigrate to the United States and how that contributes to illegal immigration. Our support is to Department of Homeland Security, which is responsible for that mission, and we are providing support in that role, the support that's appropriate for the Department of Defense to provide.
But surely you're around for the conversations about what policy might make sense. So I'm just curious, as someone who's involved in this, and the Department of Defense is now deeply into what's going on at the border because Homeland Security has asked for a lot of money and a lot of human resources. What is your thought about how we can adjust that policy to improve the situation?
Well, I can certainly say the administration has been very focused on looking at the diplomatic, the legal, the engagement with nations that are the primary sources of illegal immigration to the United States.
Yeah, the only thing I've heard is the administration talking about how they want to cut off money from those places, which doesn't strike me as a particularly productive approach. So if you could drill down a little bit, what is the administration doing to try to look at, and specifically Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, to say how can we help them towards a more stable, less desperate situation?
Well, I really cannot speak for the administration's efforts associated with engaging with countries south of the border. That's outside of my portfolio and my writ.
Anybody else want to take a stab at it?
I'll say from the perspective of the regional policy shop in OSD, we continue to focus on security cooperation efforts with Central American countries. The President has made a decision with respect to looking at our cooperation in the region, but from the DoD perspective, DoD activities are going to continue forward because the mill-to-mill relationships we find, and I'll defer to Admiral Fowler as well, are a significant source of security and stability in those countries, but in the region writ large.
And I guess that's the biggest point I want to make. There are other tools in our toolbox other than the military. In fact, we're already confronting this with the request for more mill-to-mill cooperation around Venezuela, whereas the cutoff on State Department and USAID remains in place. I just frankly do not get this administration's complete and total blind spot towards the notion that international affairs involves more than just the military. That USAID and diplomatic, cutting them off and focusing only on the military, saying to Central America, we're not going to give you any more money, just encourages more people to flow forward. That is more a message for you to deliver back to the people at the White House than anything you need to answer, but it is contributing to the problem. Because the irony for me is when the President started talking about there being an emergency at the border, there wasn't. Now there is. And I think the two are connected. So I hope we'll figure out those policies because nobody on this committee wants the Department of Defense to have their resources drained out to go to Department of Homeland Security missions. And DoD has enough to do. So we're in serious trouble down there, and we need to figure out how to better confront it. I want to give General O'Shaughnessy and Admiral Fowler a chance if you have any response, any ideas for how we can improve that situation. Don't go on for too long because I've over my time. I want to turn it over to somebody else, but just curious if you have any quick thoughts on that.
Chairman, I would just say from our vantage point, we have a role to support our CBP partners, and from the Northcom perspective, we're executing that role in the mission that we've been given to support CBP.
Okay.
I'll be in Honduras Monday next week as co-host of a Central America Security Conference with all the Central American countries, including some of the neighbors. This will be a topic of what we can do, working mutually together to better the security of both their countries and the United States homeland.
Yeah, and again, just, I hope we can include more folks than just on the security side. There's a very complex humanitarian problem down there. I think there are a lot of tools in our toolbox. We have a lot of allies and neighbors throughout the region who could help. We need to start employing all of those tools because it is a serious situation, as we all know. Mr. Thornberry.
Admiral, I appreciate the statements you made, particularly at the end, making an appeal to the Venezuelan military. It seems to me that a relatively small number of people have the future of their country in their hands. One of these days, the Venezuelan people are going to have a say, and the question is how long the suffering's got to go on. And there are folks now who are making decisions that for which they may be held accountable someday. And so I appreciate that appeal. General, I wanted to ask you briefly, you mentioned space-based sensors. Can you just, again, briefly describe why it is important that we have space-based sensors to defend the homeland?
Thank you for that opportunity. Clearly, as we look at the advanced threats that we're facing, both from Russia and China, they're of a changing nature. And our current sensors that we have are just not situated to be able to be effective against that. Part of it just the track that the weapon would take is not conducive to a terrestrial-based sensing grid. And therefore, if we look to the space-based sensors, it gives you the opportunity, for example, a hypersonic track, that you could maintain the track from birth to death, right? You could see it from the time it launched to the time that we were able to take that intercept out with an interceptor or directed energy or some sort of ability to defend against it. Right now, if we just put more money into just what we're doing today with the terrestrial-based sensors, we will never get to the point where we can actively defend against them. So the space-based sensing layer, to me, is absolutely critical if we're going to be able to defend against these advanced threats.
I appreciate it. I suspect there's more detail we can get into in a classified session, but I think that's helpful. Mr. Rapuano, Chairman said this, I think we all agree. We face an unprecedented situation at the border. The Border Patrol is completely overwhelmed. Reports this week are that military folks are going to be asked to do more tasks at the border than they have been doing before. My question to you is, why can we not use contractors for these support activities that we are now asking the military to do? Anytime any of us visit Afghanistan, other places around the world, a lot of the people doing the cooking, the cleaning, the driving, monitoring sensors are often contractors. Why can't we use contractors?
So the Department of Homeland Security and CBP have been using contractors, but what they describe to us is there's a practical limit. There are, in terms of availability of contractors in the areas where they seek to have the work done and the timelines associated with getting those contractors on task. In addition to that, there are certain functions that are DoD military capabilities, sensors, the barrier construction in terms of the concertina wire, for which we do have ready capabilities. In the other areas, and you described some of them in terms of the logistics management for migrant processing, that is not necessarily a lead military skill, but it certainly is a capability that we can provide in exigent circumstances such as being experienced today.
Well, I hope that as DoD considers requests from the Department of Homeland Security, that you look at independently the availability of contractors to perform some of these functions, especially as the ask of our military expand. I know we can do it. The question is it U.S. military, are U.S. military people the best entity to be deploying wire? As I say, contractors run sensors all over the world, and the other logistical support. I think that's maybe a better way forward than to continue to expand the job of our military. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today and your service to the country. Just to follow up on the Chairman's discussion on Venezuela, just so we're clear, first of all, I agree with where the discussion was going, that we need to apply maximum diplomatic pressure and resolve the situation with Venezuela diplomatically. But just so we don't leave anything hanging out there, we're not missing something. Have any of you in any way, shape, or form been given instruction by your leadership to prepare for any type of military conflict? Just want to make sure that we're clear on that. So pre-positioning troops or any kind of forces, we run down the line.
We, of course, always review available options and plan for contingencies, but in this case, we have not been given the sort of orders that you're discussing, no.
Okay. General, Admiral, or Ms. Secretary?
The mission sets that I discussed with respect to the Chairman's question are our principal focus, really focusing on building those partnerships, leveraging our partners, making sure that whatever happens in the future, and we know we won't be able to predict it, that we are ready to approach this together as a united region and working with our militaries has been our principal line of focus.
General.
So we're just in support of Admiral Fowler in the Southcom aspect, but nothing directly, just helping Admiral Fowler.
Okay. Ms. Secretary, anything you want to add?
No,
Okay,
nothing additional to add.
Okay, thank you. Just want to get that on the record. General O'Shaughnessy, if I could, I'm pleased that DHS's CISA has assigned a liaison officer to Northcom headquarters, and I hope that the interagency partnership will enhance the resilience of U.S. critical infrastructure, particularly in a time of crisis. What I wanted to ask is, how are you and your counterparts institutionalizing the relationship, though, so that it's not just personality-driven or public attention-driven, and that you're exercising the various scenarios under which CISA may call upon Northcom for support?
Thank you for the opportunity to highlight the close coordination and collaboration we have with the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically with respect to CISA. As you mentioned, literally within the first week of it standing up, we actually had exchanged liaisons back and forth that are full-time within each other's headquarters. And these are well-seasoned professionals who truly understand the nature of the threats that we face. Part of the way as we go forward is we are inserting ourselves and have inserted ourselves inside the battle rhythm of each other's headquarters. And so every day we have integration and coordination in the various issues that we're working. Under Secretary Nielsen, and we'll continue on, no doubt, with Acting Secretary McElwain. I actually met with them on a bi-weekly basis where we talk about not only the support to the border, but things like we're doing to support the critical infrastructure. And to the point of how do we institutionalize it, we're bringing it into our exercises. We're bringing it into both our annual exercises as well as the longer-term exercises to make sure that we do it all the way from a tabletop exercise to a full interagency exercise, that we do this together, because you simply can't separate Homeland Defense and Homeland Security. They are intertwined in ways that we need to collaborate together, not on a one-off event, not when a crisis happens, but every day.
Excellent. Thank you. The exercising part of that is essential. I agree, especially. How are you working with U.S. Cybercom also to ensure that it's prepared to support you if you're called upon in a DISCA role? And I'm thinking particularly of coordination with the national mission teams.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have kind of twofold interaction with Cyber Command in this area. One is for our own systems. Right? We have our own systems designed to defend the United States and Canada that we want to make sure are able to survive any attacks, any attempts to take them down, not only in crisis, but day to day. And so we have a day-to-day engagement with Cyber Command and their cyber teams that are actually in support of us on a regular basis. We have two actively engaged as we speak right now. In addition to that, though, as we look at the broader protection of the nation, we also, to your point, use the DISCA model of how we can work with Cyber Command to present that force to both our state, for example, within the elections was an example in 2018, how we present the force throughout the nation, both on a critical infrastructure, things like election. And that DISCA model with us is essentially the DoD synchronizer, has proven to be quite effective in hurricanes, wildfires, and so we're approaching that with the same model as we look at the cyber, and have had great success already and look forward to maturing that as we go forward.
Thank you very much.
I would just add to that at the departmental level, the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security now have a memorandum of agreement signed last year by Secretary Mattis and Secretary Nielsen, in which we are working with them across the board, starting with defense critical infrastructure as well as civil infrastructure. How are we prioritizing between the Department of Defense and DHS and the other sector lead agencies? And then how are we looking at where and how we support them best?
Absolutely. The gentleman's time has expired, and I apologize. I should have warned the witnesses. We try to keep it to 5 minutes. I will not cut you off in mid-sentence or anything, but once we hit 5 minutes, we do try to move on to other folks, even if you're in mid-question. At that point, we probably take it for the record. If you have an answer you want to submit to the member, you can do that then. Mr. Wilson.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here in your service to our country. Admiral Fowler, I'm grateful for the relationship of the U.S. Southern Command maintains with the Republic of Colombia as part of the National Guard State Sponsorship Program. Since 2012, South Carolina and Colombia have partnered to enhance military cooperation with the rotary wing and air defense capabilities. As Colombia continues to expand as a NATO global partner, how do you judge the strategies for Plan Colombia? Specifically, what are the investments DoD is making to combat terrorist activities and drug trafficking to continue the successes?
We'll start with the South Carolina Guard, a fantastic partner. In fact, they're down there this week working with the Colombians. They'll be down later this summer for an air defense exercise with some of our high-end capability exercising with Colombians. And we're very appreciative of the National Guard, what they do across the range of security cooperation. There's absolutely a wonderful partnership. Colombia's their military and security forces are making a difference, and they are taking the attack to the narco traffickers. They're taking it to the ELN, the FARC dissidents, and the results that we'll see in eradication, plateau and cocoa production, high interdiction rates. These are going to have an impact on both the internal security of Colombia and the United States security. A very capable partner. I have the utmost trust for the Colombian Armed Forces and what they do as professionals and what they do in terms of their warfighting ability.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Wheelbarger, Russia and China are expanding their presence in Latin America. They're using economic and military influence to strategically compete against the U.S. in this vital region and systematically engage with the autocratic regimes. Admiral Fowler has already cited Russia and Cuba are increasing military intelligence activities in Venezuela. What types of equipment, aircraft, or capabilities are you most concerned about?
I'll defer to Admiral Fowler for the specific technical concerns, but in terms of Russia and Chinese influence writ large in the region, we're very focused on countering that influence with our own productive activities, with building partner capacity. As I discussed in the opening, we really see our national defense strategy encourages us as a department to look at these as global threats, and that includes countering the influence in our region. Or in our hemisphere, excuse me. Therefore, we are consistently and continuously looking for opportunities to build our partners and build new relationships, and we have a significant opportunity right now to do so. With respect to their specific activity in Venezuela, as it was cited at the beginning this morning with respect to Secretary Pompeo's statements, it's not just technical concerns that we have, but it's just the overall influence that they can have and bear on the decision-making of these countries. And that's why we as an international community call on Russia and China in particular to cease their support to the Maduro regime.
Thank you. And General O'Shaughnessy, the North American Aerospace Command is improving defense coverage of the national capital region. The South Carolina National Guard currently has personnel in the region to support this mission. What is your timeline of the three-phase plan to expand the national capital region architecture to protect the rest of the country? And are you working with our neighbor Canada?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And as you highlight, the Guard participation in all the defense within NORAD and Northcom is significant. And the example you use in the national capital region, as we sit right here today, we have Guardsmen on alert protecting us literally as we sit here today. And so my hat's off to the great support that we get from them. Now, with respect to the specifically the Homeland Defense Design Phase 1 and Phase 2 are actually funded in Phase 1 in place, Phase 2 ongoing now. As we look to Phase 3, it becomes significantly more complicated as the threat has continued to develop as well. And so we're continuing to refine what that Homeland Defense design should look like going into the future with the advanced threats, hypersonics, et cetera, cruise missiles that we know we have to defend against. And we are using the basis from the Homeland Defense Phase 1 and 2 as the starting point, but in a much more complicated and complex manner to defend both the United States and Canada.
And the level of synchronization with Canada?
Extreme. NORAD's 60 years of history of the great relationship with NORAD and the modernization within NORAD. We're trying to look binationally. I can submit for the record some studies that we're doing binationally with Canada in the interest of time, but we are looking at this together with Canada.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Larson.
Thank you. General, the Coast Guard came out with their Arctic strategy a few weeks ago. It's called Protecting Sovereignty. The administration under General Mattis at the time said that it had an updated military strategy in June. Is that will we have that by June?
I will defer to OSD on that. We have been working with the OSD office that is working that strategy.
All right. OSD, is that going to be done by June?
My belief is I currently understand that it will be. I was seeing sort of final deliberations over the last couple of weeks, so we will get you an update if we think it's going to be delayed for any reason. Please
do that. Thank you. And back to General then. Could you talk a little bit, in your testimony, pages 11 through 12-ish or so, you're the DoD advocate for Arctic capabilities and the combatant commander responsible for independent approach to the homeland. Rather than get into what Russia and China are doing, could you just review your testimony a little bit for us on what we are doing? Because the Arctic has been obvious interest for us for a long time. What are we doing that isn't in response to Russia and China? What are we doing because we ought to be doing it for our own reasons?
Right, and really, as we look at the Arctic, it is a very difficult operating environment, and so we feel that we need the ability to operate in that environment. And so, for example, the work we're doing at the Jay Park Range in Alaska gives us the ability to train our force in ways that we haven't been getting after for the last several decades. If you look at the work that we're doing, the U.S. Navy, for example, sailed the Harry S. Truman in the high north that we hadn't done in literally decades. And so we are really trying to, from exposing our team, our airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, to that environment and making sure that we are prepared to operate. Just last week, I personally went out to Thule Air Base in Greenland. I went up to Nunavik in higher areas of Canada. And I will tell you firsthand, those conditions that we're going to ask our force to operate in are extreme, and you can't go there without the adequate preparation and training. The second thing we're looking on is actually what do we need to be able to operate there? So we look at domain awareness. We look at our ability to communicate. Many of the traditional means of communication simply don't work in the Arctic. We're looking at our ability to sustain those operations there so that once we have the training, we'll have the ability to actually have a force with an infrastructure that will actually support them in a sustained way. The way we're looking to advocate for that is we are working closely with UCOM and PACOM so as we can be the lead, but it is not something that is just done alone at Northcom and NORAD. It is done in coordination with our sister combatant commands, but it's also done, for example, with the Coast Guard. And as they are looking to get the heavy icebreaker, critically important for us. And so it's that coordination and doing these things together. We're running symposiums. We're trying to be a little bit of the vocal advocate for it, not only within DOD, but within the interagency as well. And we'll continue to take those measures.
How are you using the CONUS bases as platforms for deployment?
Well, I think as we look at some of the places here within the CONUS, we have, for example, the Air National Guard, the 109th, has the LC-130s that have capability that is absolutely critical for us. And so being able to use that, in fact, they were up in Greenland last week as well. They're up there for about a 4-month tour. They'll also go down to Antarctica, but making sure we use that capability and that expertise. Now, as far as other bases within the U.S., in the CONUS, we try to take advantage of some of the experiences that we have that we can leverage forward. What we see right now is look at, for example, some of the operations that we see are just a lack of experience of being in those environments.
Yeah, thanks. Secretary Wheelbarger, we'll expect then maybe just by the end of the week, get us an update on more precise timeline.
Yeah, we'll get you an update by the end of the week.
That'd be great. Thank you. And I'll yield back to myself and recognize Ms. Hartzler for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General O'Shaughnessy, the F-15C fleet based within the U.S. is tasked with, as you know, supporting our top mission of defending the homeland. And the Air Force plans to refresh the F-15C fleet with the F-15EX and has requested funding for 8 aircraft in the FY20 budget. So how would bringing advanced F-15s into these units impact Northcom in terms of the capacity and capabilities available for the Homeland Defense?
Well, ma'am, as you, I think you know, the Air Force has very publicly talked about they need 72 aircraft a year in their procurement in order to sustain and grow the Air Force to the size that it needs to be. We are one of those requirements, right? We are one of the forcing agents for the U.S. Air Force to respond to that demand signal. And so we are very supportive of the work that they are doing to maintain a capability and capacity to support all the requirements. We also understand that they're committed to 5th gen, and that hasn't changed as we do go forward. But as we look at the readiness capability of a sustained 4th gen fleet, it needs to be refreshed. And as such, we are looking forward to continue to work with the Air Force, make sure they provide us the capability and capacity we need, and we support the Air Force's initiatives going forward.
So you support their plan to buy more F-15Es?
Right. We are fairly agnostic to the platform in the sense of a capability, a capacity that we need them to have, and so I do support General Goldfein, Secretary Wilson, and the approach that they have taken to have both readiness and capability and capacity available for us as a combatant commander.
So the Air Force has testified that converting F-15C squadrons to the F-15EX will better support the needs of the Air Force and combatant commands by minimizing the downtime of mission conversion. Compared to the years it would take to convert to an entirely new platform, the Air Force believes units transitioning between F-15 variants would take just months. Looking at the forces available to Northcom today, how important is that mission conversion timeline to meeting your requirements?
Well, man, the service will be ultimately responsible for that, but what we can't afford is a gap, right? We cannot have a gap in the capability and the capacity. As we sit here today, you know, we have 5 different F-15 units that support us within NORAD. It is an important platform for us, and in the end, we can't afford to have any detriment in the capacity or capability we have supporting NORAD.
Okay. In your written testimony, you discussed the challenges of unmanned aerial systems in the U.S. airspace and the importance of the authorities provided to DOJ and DHS in the recent FAA Reauthorization Act. DOD has also received counter-UAS authorities in both the FY17 and FY18 NDAAs. How is Northcom using the granted DOD authorities, and have any gaps been identified from a COCOM perspective?
Ma'am, I'd first like to start by thanking you and your team for the great support that we've had with respect to these authorities over the last several years, of not only for the DOD, because it's an important aspect for us, for our authorities, but as you mentioned, the interagency is equally as important. And so as we work closely with Department of Homeland Security, and as you work to help get them the similar authorities that we have within DOD, that has been extremely helpful. The example I use is right here within the National Capital Region, where we're working closely with many sub-organizations within DHS, but also DOJ, the Capitol Police, the local police, and the individual services, as we work an exercise here in about 2 weeks to try to bring all that together. And it is very complex. And so it's a question of the authorities we have and then the tools and the kit that we have to actually defeat any threat that we have with the counter-UAS. So the exercises that we're doing are driving us to better understand if there are additional authorities or requirements that we might have, and we'll stay in close coordination and collaboration with your team and this committee as we go forth potentially with more authorities that we'll be seeking.
Yeah, appreciate your work on that and look forward to continuing to work with you on it, because it is such a very important mission. And lastly, another question. I'm proud to, as you know, represent Fort Leonard Wood in my district, which contributes vital capabilities to Northcom by training service members for specialties such as military police and the CBRN response. In your written testimony, you discussed Northcom's defense support of civil authorities' mission and provided many examples of interagency coordination. Can you talk in more detail about coordination and training activities among DoD CBRN specialists and civilian CBRN experts aimed at protecting the homeland?
Yes, ma'am. And let me first thank you and actually Fort Leonard Wood is instrumental to our ability to have this capability. We have about 18,000 personnel at any given time that are committed to the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear response efforts. We have 57 CST or teams that are designed within the states to be able to respond. And those, almost to a person, they're trained at Fort Leonard Wood. And it's also the training they do is also within the interagency and the local law enforcement officials and the first responders that they'll work with. And so I know we're short on time, but I'll just say absolutely critical, and we would not be able to do it without the expertise resident there. And it is not just within DOD, but within the broader response.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Again, looking at the sort of mission of Southern Command, and I think it's been referenced by some prior remarks, obviously the migration issue in terms of where there's instability is certainly the issue of the day. The administration's decision to cut aid to the Northern Triangle countries, again, I think has just totally flabbergasted people in terms of how that possibly helped stabilize that situation. Mr. Chairman, I have a statement that was signed by 5 combatant commanders of the U.S. Southern Command, General Craddock, General Hill, General McCaffrey, Admiral Stavridis, General Wilhelm, who all basically make the point that the solution in terms of the drivers that cause people to leave their country and move north, that cutting aid to the region will only increase the drivers and will be even more costly to deal with our border. I'd ask that it be admitted to the record.
That's 5 former combatant commanders.
Correct.
Right? But yes, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Yeah, no slight intended, Admiral. And I want to thank you for being here today. It's good to see you back on the Hill. Again, maybe Ms. Wheelbarger or Mr. Rapuano can respond to that question. How on earth cutting aid, which doesn't go to the governments, they actually go to NGOs, faith-based groups, all the folks who are trying to help individuals who are definitely in crisis in economies and almost failed states in those regions, how that's going to help us at the border deal with this problem.
I'll just start by saying, as I explained before, we are continuing our mill-to-mill and MOD to DoD partnerships in the region as much as we can. We will inevitably be impacted somewhat by the ending or the pausing of State Department support. We agree that it is important to do all we can to bring stability and security to the regions, both to the central region, but also around the hemisphere. And that a key part of that, again, is an interagency process that uses a whole-of-government approach. I think our perspective is that we will be reviewing what our security cooperation is in light of the decision, and we're reviewing foreign assistance writ large in the region over the coming weeks and months.
As those former combatant commanders stated pretty powerfully, is that military alone cannot strengthen the investments for development and deployment. And the other whole of government has to be part of the effort, and otherwise, you're just chasing something that you'll never catch in terms of trying to deal with this issue. Admiral, we talked yesterday about the flow of drugs into our country, particularly New England, which has been hard hit by the addiction issue. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your efforts with the Coast Guard in terms of interdiction.
The drugs and the deaths as a result of drugs in this country are certainly a national security crisis. The flow of those drugs, cocaine principally from Colombia, heroin from Mexico, and then fentanyl from China and other sources, all mixed together in a concoction that's killing our citizens. The Coast Guard is our #1 partner. At our Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West, we have 20 partner nations and all elements of the U.S. government laser focused on this across both the Northcom and the Southcom boundaries, because, as you know, sir, the drug traffickers know no seams. They exploit them. The Coast Guard's presence any given day is 6 to 8 cutters, assets beyond that, and our Navy's now stepping up. This fall we'll have a littoral combat ship. But keep in mind, we're talking about covering an area the size of the United States with from 6 to 10 ships. And so the interdiction percentage with the current assets we have is about 6% of the detections. So we need more ships, we need more intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to include maritime patrol aircraft. The Navy's contributed 2 P-8s. Customs Borders Protection has some P-3s in the hunt, and those are our critical needs.
And you mentioned the littoral combat ship as being an additional asset that maybe can be brought to this mission. I mean, could you talk quickly about where that stands?
We'll get
By quickly, he means 5 seconds.
We'll get our first one this fall. The Navy needs more ships. We welcome those ships in Southcom.
Okay, very good. Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. General Shaughnessy, always good to see you, and welcome to our community. I'd like to ask a question about missile defense, and then a more Colorado-based question. But first of all, and Mr. Rapuano, if you want to weigh in on this also, you'd be welcome to. Given that the redesigned kill vehicle schedule continues to slide to the right, do you think it makes sense to consider next generation solutions? And I'm thinking of the MOKV, the multiple object kill vehicle, because the threat is out there and we don't want to get caught with the threats not being able to address the threats. So MOKV, should we start working on that and accelerate our work on that?
Well, thank you, sir. First, I would say, with respect to the RKV, I do have a concern, as you would expect, from the operational perspective of the delay as it hit the critical design review and was not ready to move forward. So we've been working closely with General Greaves, MDA. In fact, immediately after that was highlighted, I went down to the headquarters personally, met not only with General Greaves, but the technical experts to better understand not just the RKV, but the broader system of systems and things that we could do. From my perspective, I'm very concerned about the overall capacity and capability. In other words, if we look at North Korea as an example, there's a capability that we need to have to be able to intercept any missiles they shoot, but it's also a capacity that we need to maintain. And so we want to make sure that between the radars, between the kill vehicles, that we maintain ahead of that capacity. So without getting a technical discussion, which of course we'd have to go classified, I would say that it's really a bit of both. In other words, I don't know that you can just skip the RKV, but certainly the MOKV needs to be continued to be pursued because, as you highlighted, it does give you the ability to go after multiple objects. And so I think as we go forward, we can have a follow-on discussion to classified, but I do believe we need to continue to pursue the RKV, but also look at the MOKV.
Okay.
MOKV
Well, thank you,
forward.
General. Mr. Rapuano, would you want to weigh in on that?
I think General O'Shaughnessy covered it quite well. It's really what the trade space is in terms of time as well as capabilities between RKV and MOKV, and those are the things that we're looking at because we see adversaries continuing to develop their capabilities, but we want to make sure that the trade we make is a balanced trade.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, General O'Shaughnessy, I want to ask you about a Colorado-specific question. As you know, in northwest Colorado, we have the HATS site, or the High Altitude Army and National Guard Aviation Training Site, and that's on public land. There's been legislation introduced by some of the Colorado delegation to declare large areas of Colorado wilderness, and I'm sure this is unintentional, but it could have the effect of shutting down that aviation training site because wilderness use is very limited, very stringently controlled. So do you have concerns about this legislation, which is H.R. 823, and how it might affect the HATS site and affect firefighting as well?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm not, I don't have a direct involvement in that as a Northcom or NORAD, but I clearly understand the dilemma that this would put us in within the services. And so I look forward to working with your team going forward to see if there's something we can do together to address this issue.
Okay, we'll stay in touch with you on that. It is a work in progress. I just wanted to get you to weigh in on that because it is of concern in our state. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Fowler, you indicated that one of your responsibilities is drug interdiction. Is that correct?
It's a detection, monitoring, and then the interdiction as well, yes, sir.
Thank you. How do most drugs enter the United States?
Most drugs come through the United States, crossing in through Central America, up through Mexico, across the border, and also through the other means, containers, the mails, the ports, particularly the fentanyl, which has been the latest trend.
Okay. How about the oceans or the Caribbean and the Pacific?
Sort of both the Caribbean and the Pacific are high transit areas as the drugs flow out of.
Those drugs that enter through from Mexico enter through the ports of entry or through unsealed border?
So I'd defer to General O'Shaughnessy on the entry.
So I would say both, and as we work with our Customs Border Protection, we certainly see it through the ports of entry, we certainly see it through the containers, but we also see it through the open border.
I see. How best can we spend $6 to $8 billion on border fences or on Coast Guard activities, littoral combat ships, improvement of our detection at the port of entries? How would we best spend $6 to $8 billion?
Sir, from my perspective, it's a little bit. It's not one silver bullet that's going to defeat this threat to our nation.
So, how much would you apply to border walls versus ports of entry?
I would defer to policy on the specifics of that, but what I would say is really needs to be a little bit of everything.
So border barriers is one approach in terms of...
And then the question was where would we best spend the money?
So if we were solely considering counter-narcotics as the primary function that we were investing in addressing versus all the other dynamics associated with the border?
My question is drugs, how best could we spend the money?
Well, I can't
Would you
speak-
spend it on the Coast Guard? Would you spend it on ports of entry? Or would you spend it on walls?
I don't have the counter-drug portfolio.
It's your task. You're not going to answer the question.
No, I simply don't have the information to answer the question in terms of looking at drugs solely versus looking at border security or operational control of the border, which are two primary
Thank you.
priorities.
And you're not answering the question. Could you please provide me with the data? Thank you. General Sanashi, we have missile threats, we have cyber threats. What is the most imminent of those two threats?
Sure, I think in the near term, cyber threats are happening every day, quite literally. That said, I do have significant concern on the kinetic or missile threats as well.
So cyber threat is the most imminent, that is here and now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And with regard to the cyber threat, amongst those threats, what is the most imminent of those threats?
Sure, I think as we look at what is happening every day within our infrastructure, when I say our infrastructure, I mean as a nation, not as the Department of Defense. Clearly, we see both Russia, China working in malicious ways.
Okay, including things like elections. Therefore, where should we apply our money and our talent and task? To the immediate problem or to the long-term problem? I understand we'll probably do both, but is our relationship?
Well, again, sir, I do believe it's not one silver bullet that's going to take care of all of the threats that we're faced with. So it is both. I know from our cyber command is working diligently on the cyber threat.
Thank you, and I'll just get back on it here. We have an imminent threat, immediate threat. We need to attend to that immediately. The long-term threat, missile defense and so forth are also out there. I understand that. What is the single point of failure in the American system of our electronic systems? It's GPS. It's been identified by the federal government for the last 25 years as the single point of failure. We lose GPS, these lights go out, your cell phone won't work, nothing will work. Most of the military equipment won't work. Is there a backup system to GPS?
I'm sure what I'd like to do is address that in a classified environment with you.
My time is out. The answer is there is one available but does not yet exist, and it is a problem for the continental United States. It is called ELRAN.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, lady and gentlemen, for being here, and thank you for the work that you do. I wasn't here earlier, and you may have already addressed this, and if you did, if you would just quickly summarize it, but I'd like to know from your perspective, I know you're not the Department of State, where we are today with regard to the situation in Venezuela.
I'll start. I think from our perspective, we continue to see the policy and our strategy of multilateral, international, diplomatic, and economic pressure on the Maduro clique as working. The kind of regional support we see in rallying against him and for the interim president is a historical moment. We will be watching over the course of today as events unfold, because there has been calls for further protests. I think yesterday was a significant day, but we are watching what's unfolding today as well, because they have called for further protests, and we are seeing further pressure put on Maduro around the international community, but also from within his own system.
Are there concerns that what's happening in Venezuela might destabilize some of their neighbors who are allies of ours in that region?
Of course, that's a significant challenge we face and we focus on, particularly given the migrant flows into Colombia and Brazil in particular. These are solid, important partners in the region for us and for regional stability, and so we remain focused and concerned about the potential spillover effects to the region.
All right, thank you.